The studio froze. Cameras kept rolling, but nobody dared to breathe. Even the hum of the lights seemed louder than the silence that filled the air. Chris Wallace, known for his sharp edges and relentless style, had just fired a question so pointed, it felt less like an inquiry and more like a trap. His words cut through the broadcast like a blade, meant to corner, meant to expose, meant to make Jasmine Crockett stumble. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing the tension that electrified the room. Wallace's gaze held steady, eyebrows raised. With the confidence of a man who had pressed hundreds of politicians into uncomfortable corners, his tone dripped with finality as though the question itself was proof of superiority. To many, it was a familiar display of old guard authority, where the interviewer assumed command and the guest was expected to squirm. But this time something was different. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't rush. She didn't swallow hard or look down at her notes. Instead, she held her ground with a calm poise that unsettled the very balance of the exchange. The question was designed to reduce her, to paint her into a corner where she would either falter or lash out, and yet the stillness in her eyes suggested she saw something Wallace didn't. An opening. The camera zoomed closer. You could almost feel the producers behind the glass pressing forward, sensing a moment that could define the night's broadcast. Crockett's paws stretched, not with hesitation, but with control. Each second felt heavier, charged with an anticipation. So sharp, it almost hurt. Wallace's smirk faded slightly, his confidence beginning to waver as he realized she wasn't rattled, she was calculating. What she said next wasn't just an answer. It was a revelation that rewrote the room. The silence wasn't emptiness. It was the world leaning in, waiting for a response that no one expected but everyone would remember. In that suspended breath of live television, dignity prepared to meet condescension. The collision, when it came, would leave not just a studio but an entire audience frozen in awe. But to understand why this single answer left the entire studio in stunned silence, we need to rewind. Politics in America has never been a quiet game, but in this moment, the noise felt deafening. The country was already repolarized, debates raging online, communities split down the middle, each news cycle more exhausting than the last. Every word spoken on live television had the weight of a national verdict. Every soundbite capable of turning into the next viral firestorm. It wasn't just conversation anymore. It was battle. And into that battle stepped Jasmine Crockett, seated across from Chris Wallace. Under the glare of cameras that broadcast not just to millions of homes but into the beating heart of America's living rooms, the stakes weren't theoretical, they were personal. For every viewer who had felt unheard, unseen, dismissed by those in power, Crockett's presence at that table meant possibility, but it also meant peril. Chris Wallace was not just another interviewer. He was the seasoned gatekeeper, the man whose reputation was built on leaving politicians sweating under the studio lights. He had grilled senators, pressed presidents, cornered cabinet members. His style was surgical precise, relentless, designed to expose cracks in the facade. Too many. Facing Wallace was a rite of passage. Survive him, and you proved your legitimacy. Fail, and your stumble lived forever in the archives of political humiliation. That night, Wallace sharpened his blade for Jasmine Crockett, a rising figure, whose star power was undeniable but whose presence still triggered dismissiveness from old guard commentators. She was new enough to be underestimated, bold enough to rattle entrenched systems, and unapologetically representative of communities, too often pushed to the margins. To some, she was an inspiration. To others, she was a threat. And Wallace, with decades of broadcasting behind him, embodied the skepticism of a world reluctant to yield space to voices like hers. Every second on that stage mattered. Crockett's words weren't simply about policy or perspective. They were about survival in an arena where one misstep could be clipped, remixed, and weaponized across every platform within minutes. In this environment, truth wasn't just told. It was tested under fire. The live studio audience could feel it too. They weren't just watching an interview. They were witnessing a collision of eras, of identities, of what America was and what America could become. Wallace leaned in with that trademark tone, calm but cutting, polite yet piercing. It was the voice of authority challenging the legitimacy of the newcomer. And Crockett, sitting across from him, represented every young leader, every immigrant's child, every fighter who dared to step into the spotlight despite knowing the deck was stacked against them. This wasn't just about answering a tough question. It was about proving that dignity could stand firm even when pressure was weaponized. It was about holding one's ground in a space designed to knock you off balance. And in that delicate dance between interviewer and guest, the stakes for Crockett were doubled. She wasn't only defending her words, she was defending what she represented: equity, resilience, the courage to belong. The moment stretched beyond politics. It was about power, perception, and the ability to command silence in a room built for noise. Every viewer watching, whether they admitted it or not, felt the tension of that weight. What happens when you push someone who has spent their life rising against the odds? What happens when you try to box in a voice that was never meant to stay quiet? Few could have guessed that one answer would ripple far beyond that studio, shaking not only Chris Wallace, but the very narrative of who gets to speak with authority in America for decades. Chris Wallace carved a reputation that few in journalism could rival. He wasn't the kind of anchor who relied on charisma or theatrics. His weapon was precision. His interviews were clinics in control, meticulously constructed to peel back layers of rhetoric until his subject stood exposed. Viewers tuned in not just for the answers, but for the spectacle of watching seasoned politicians squirm beneath his steady gaze. His reputation had roots and legacy. The son of famed journalist Mike Wallace, Chris inherited not only a last name, but also the expectation of excellence. From his earliest years on television, he displayed the instincts of someone who understood the weight of the medium. Television wasn't just about information, it was about dominance. Whoever held the sharper question, the tighter follow-up. The refusal to let an answer slip by that was the one who held the power. Over time, Wallace became known as a man who could corner even the most disciplined figures. Presidents dreaded his interviews. Senators prepped feverishly before facing him. His technique was deliberate. Ask, listen, interrupt at the precise second a talking point emerged, and press harder. He embodied the role of watchdog, but with it came a certain relish for the hunt. He didn't just want clarity, he wanted to break through defenses and claim victory in the exchange. Asterisk, the public admired him for it. In an era when so many journalists were accused of softballing the powerful, Wallace represented rigor. His interviews became viral before viral was a term. Entire careers had been dented by one exchange under his scrutiny. He prided himself on being equal opportunity in his toughness, grilling leaders from both sides of the aisle. But while admirers called him fair, critics often noted something else, a tone that tipped from authoritative into condescending, especially when facing those who didn't carry the shield of establishment gravitas. There was a pattern, subtle but undeniable. Wallace reserved his sharpest edge for those he perceived as outsiders. Established figures were sparred with, yes, but newer voices often faced a different kind of treatment. His questions became more barbed, his interruptions more aggressive, as if to test not just their answers, but their right to occupy the chair. Across from him, it was this posture, half skeptic, half gatekeeper, that turned interviews into trials. That edge made him formidable, but it also framed him as the embodiment of an old-guard media culture. He was the legacy journalist, a standard bearer of an era where authority flowed in one direction from the interviewer down. His confidence wasn't arrogance in his own eyes. It was tradition. And yet two emerging voices, it could feel like. A gauntlet thrown down. Prove yourself or be dismissed. On live television, Wallace wielded silence like a sword. He would let a moment hang, stretching the discomfort until the other person filled the gap with words they hadn't intended to reveal. He would smirk when a politician stumbled, arch an eyebrow when a statistic faltered. These were the small signals of dominance, the subtle cues that reminded the audience who was truly in control. Even his cadence carried weight. His tone was calm, measured, but beneath it was the unmistakable rhythm of interrogation. He rarely raised his voice. Didn't need to. The steel was in his restraint, in the deliberate pauses that signaled he was dissecting every syllable for weakness. Facing him wasn't like a conversation, it was like stepping into a courtroom where the jury was the entire nation. This history mattered because it set the stage for what was to come. Wallace wasn't a villain in the cartoonish sense. He wasn't malicious, but he was intimidating, an institution unto himself, and institutions have a way of pressing down on those who challenge them. For years, he had maintained his dominance by sheer mastery of the medium, by knowing how to unsettle, how to control, how to win. But that night, across from Jasmine Crockett, the dynamics were about to shift. She wasn't the typical guest who stumbled under pressure. She wasn't there to be lectured into submission. And Wallace, for all his skill and legacy, had perhaps underestimated the force of composure that comes not from power inherited, but from battles fought and survived. And yet for all his years of dominance, Wallace had never faced someone quite like Jasmine Crockett. Long before she sat under the bright lights of a national broadcast, Jasmine Crockett's story was already one of defiance and survival. She wasn't born into privilege. She wasn't handed a microphone or a platform. Her journey began in the margins, where voices like hers were often dismissed before they were even heard. The odds were never in her favor. And yet, from an early age, she carried a stubborn determination that told the world she would not be erased as a child. She saw the double standards of the system up close. Friends and neighbors treated unfairly. Families struggling to be recognized, communities pushed aside in favor of those with louder names and deeper pockets. These weren't abstract lessons learned in textbooks. They were daily realities that etched themselves into her character. Where others saw injustice and shrugged, she saw it and simmered, knowing she had to do something more than endure it. Education became her weapon. She pursued law not out of ambition for prestige, but from a burning need to protect those who could not protect themselves. In the courtroom, she discovered a truth that would shape her career. The law could be as sharp as the people who wielded it. She quickly earned a reputation as an advocate who refused to back down, even when the odds were stacked against her. Whether defending civil rights, standing against overreach, or fighting for those who couldn't afford powerful representation, Crockett became a voice that didn't quiver when challenged. Her career was defined less by victories on paper, and more by the spirit she carried into every fight. Judges, juries, opponents, many underestimated her because of her background, her age, her identity, and time after time, she turned those assumptions into fuel. Each attempt to silence her only sharpened her resolve. Each dismissal only confirmed what she already knew: that dignity is strongest when forged in fire. In politics, the challenges multiplied. Entering the public arena meant opening herself to an even larger scale of doubt and scrutiny. Her opponents painted her as too inexperienced, too outspoken, too untested. But Crockett's strength was never in playing the part expected of her. It was in refusing to bend to roles others wrote for her. Her speeches were fiery but grounded in truth. Her debates sharp but never reckless. What made her stand out wasn't noise, it was clarity, and beneath that clarity was empathy. Crockett carried the stories of those she represented like armor. She knew the faces behind the policies, the families behind the statistics. She wasn't simply reciting data. She was channeling lived experience into power. That empathy made her a natural advocate, but it also made her dangerous to systems that thrived on detachment. Still, her rise wasn't without scars. Every step forward had been met with resistance, sometimes outright hostility. Could be unforgiving, twisting her words, framing her presence as disruption rather than contribution. Yet even when mischaracterized, she refused to lash out in a way that would validate the caricatures. Instead, she learned the art of composure, a kind of stillness that unnerves aggressors more than any outburst ever could. This composure wasn't the absence of fire, it was fire under control. Crockett knew that calmness wasn't weakness, it was strength in its most disciplined form. When others shouted, she steadied. When others tried to provoke, she smiled. Her power came not from outvoluming her detractors, but from outlasting them, outthinking them, and standing so firmly in her truth that the attacks crumbled against it. By the time she walked into the studio across from Chris Wallace, Crockett was more than a rising political figure. She was a survivor of battles that had tested her identity, her patience, and her purpose. She was a woman who carried not just her own story, but the weight of generations who had been told to wait their turn, to tone it down, to be grateful for scraps of recognition. She carried all of that, and she carried it with grace. And so, when Wallace leaned forward with the sharp edge of his question, what he didn't see was the preparation behind her pause. Didn't see the childhood lessons that taught her how injustice wears many disguises. He didn't see the late nights in law school, the grueling court battles, the countless times she'd been underestimated only to stand taller. He didn't see the empathy that anchored her, or the scars that had toughened her. What he saw was silence. What he missed was strength. This was the strength she carried into that studio, and the reason her calm answer hit like thunder. The moment snapped back into focus, the rewind complete. The studio lights burned hotter, and Chris Wallace leaned in with the certainty of a man who had cornered countless figures before. His question wasn't a single strike, it was the opening salvo of a barrage. He pressed again, layering the same accusation in different words, a tactic honed by years of experience. Each interruption came quicker than the last, as though cutting her off might expose hesitation. His voice, calm on the surface, carried the unmistakable undercurrent of authority. He wasn't just asking for clarity, he was daring her to stumble too. Viewers at home, it was a familiar performance. Wallace's style was the hammer, built to shatter facades. But this time, the hammer met something immovable. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to fill the space he created. She didn't flinch when he cut her off mid-sentence. Instead, she allowed the tension to thicken, the silence to hang heavy, letting Wallace expend his energy in a storm of words. The more he pressed, the calmer she became. It was as if she understood instinctively that her composure was the real weapon. Her restraint, the sharpest blade. The clash unfolded like a duel. Wallace lunging with verbal thrusts, Crockett parrying. With stillness, he spoke faster. She slowed down, pushed harder. She leaned back, eyes steady, posture unwavering. His attempts to unsettle her only deepened the contrast between the aggression on one side, grace on the other. In the studio, the shift was palpable. The audience, producers, staff, even technicians behind the glass felt the change in balance. What began as Wallace's arena slowly bent toward Crockett, her poise transformed the atmosphere, making his interruptions feel less like control and more like desperation. At home, viewers tweeted in real time, her comments sharp, impatient, breathless. Let her finish. Watch her flip this. The nation was leaning forward, waiting for the inevitable turn, and Wallace knew it too. Beneath the polish of his delivery, a flicker of frustration crossed his face. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The script he had written in his head, the young politician fumbling, the seasoned journalist dominating, was slipping away. The longer Crockett refused to be baited, the more power she quietly reclaimed. Every interruption became less effective. Every attempted trap more transparent. Crockett's silence was louder than his insistence, her composure more compelling than his questions. It wasn't resistance for the sake of defiance, it was discipline. The kind born from a lifetime of fighting battles where composure was the only shield that kept you standing. The duel stretched, the tension mounting with every exchange. Viewers weren't just watching an interview. They were witnessing a test of wills. Wallace represented legacy, dominance, the gatekeeping of old authority. Crockett embodied resilience, dignity, and the quiet revolution of voices long told they didn't belong. It felt like the air itself was bracing for collision. Wallace fired one last time, sharpening his words into a final attempt to corner her. His voice rose ever so slightly, not shouting, but tight, impatient, signaling he wanted control back. And that was when Crockett drew a breath. A single, steady inhale that cut through the chaos. She didn't raise her hand or her voice. Simply prepared to speak with the same calm that had carried her through courtrooms, campaigns, and every attempt to push her aside. The studio froze. Again, sensing the turn, Wallace leaned back, waiting. The audience leaned forward, desperate. And then, with one deep breath, Jasmine Crockett delivered the answer that changed everything. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush. She didn't stumble into the trap Wallace had laid with his carefully worded challenge. Instead, she let the silence expand. A silence so sharp it cut through the air like glass. The studio, already tense, seemed to teeter on the edge of something irreversible. Every pair of eyes was locked on her, waiting. Wallace leaned forward slightly, expecting, perhaps even daring, a flustered defense. But Crockett didn't give him what he expected. She lifted her chin, steady, and met his stare with eyes that refused to blink. The pause wasn't hesitation, it was control. It was the deliberate stillness of someone who knew that timing was power. When she finally spoke, her voice didn't rise. It dropped, low and clear, slicing through the noise with surgical precision. You asked me that question? As if the people I represent don't already know the answer. The words landed like a drumbeat, reverberating in the stillness. Wallace blinked. Just once, but enough for the audience to see. He had built the tension, but she had seized it, redirected it, turned it into her weapon. Crockett let the weight of her first sentence linger before continuing. She leaned ever so slightly forward, not in aggression, but in emphasis, her voice still calm, her diction precise. I've lived the consequences of policies that were designed without people. Like us in the room, I've watched families lose everything because leaders cared more about their egos than their people. So if you think I'll be cornered into defending dignity, let me be clear. Dignity doesn't need defense. It reveals itself, even when others try to bury it. A murmur rippled through the studio audience. It wasn't loud, but it was there, an audible recognition that the power dynamic had shifted. Wallace adjusted in his chair, his practiced neutrality slipping as his lips pressed into a thin line. He opened his mouth, ready to interrupt again. But Crockett raised her hand, ever so slightly, not a gesture of dominance, but of composure. And in that moment, even Wallace hesitated. Every camera leaned in. Producers froze behind the glass, sensing the headline unfolding before them. Crockett didn't look at Wallace anymore. She looked past him, into the lens, speaking not just to a man in the studio, but to millions watching at home. You want to know why I sit here calmly? It's because my calm was forged in fire. It's because I learned long ago that people who look like me, people who fight like me, aren't given the luxury of mistakes. We have to be sharper, steadier, better just to stand where others take their seats for granted. And if my presence makes anyone uncomfortable, then maybe it's time to ask why truth feels threatening. The silence spread like wildfire. Studio had become a cathedral of stillness, where every word rang louder than the last. Viewers at home felt the shift the moment when the hunted became the hunter. When the interview stopped being an interrogation and turned into testimony, Wallace tried again, his voice slightly tighter now, his question rephrased to claw back. Authority. But Representative, don't you think Crockett cut him off without raising her volume? She didn't need to. No. Chris, what I think is that the people are tired of being lectured about patience, while their lives hang in the balance. They're tired of watching conversations about them happen without them, and they are absolutely tired of being told they don't belong at the table, when in fact, they built the very table this country sits at. A collective exhale swept through the audience. Someone in the back nodded. Another muttered a quiet, "That's right." The energy was undeniable. Wallace's shoulders stiffened, his practiced composure thinning under the weight of a truth he hadn't expected to face. He tried to pivot, but every pivot seemed clumsier. Every attempt to regain footing met with Crockett's immovable calm. She didn't gloat. She didn't sneer. She didn't need to. Her strength was in the restraint, in the refusal to meet aggression with aggression. Instead, she returned again and again to clarity, to truth, to the lived experiences that gave her words authority no journalist could undercut. And the more she spoke, the smaller Wallace seemed. His reputation as the nation's sharpest interrogator hadn't prepared him for this. A woman who wouldn't be rattled, who wouldn't play the role of the flustered newcomer, who wouldn't accept the framework he tried to impose. Crockett's closing line came like the strike of a bell, measured and final. "You asked me a question, as if I should be ashamed to answer it. But the only shame here is how often this country underestimates the very people who keep it alive. I'm not here to prove myself worthy of the spotlight. I'm here because the spotlight finally caught up to where we've always been standing." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Wallace's mouth was half open, but no words came. The audience sat frozen. Even the hum of the cameras seemed to fade beneath the weight of what had just been spoken. That silence was the answer. It was louder than any applause, heavier than any rebuttal. And in that silence, it became clear. Crockett had flipped the script. Social media would soon erupt. Hashtags, clips, memes flying across platforms, but in that exact second, inside that studio, there was only one undeniable truth. Chris Wallace had pushed. Jasmine Crockett had not only stood her ground, she had risen above it. She sat back, composed, unshaken, radiating calm power. The duel was over, and everyone watching knew exactly who had won. The moment Jasmine Crockett finished speaking, the silence in the studio seemed to stretch on forever. Commentators who had prepared their usual quick-fire responses sat frozen, their notes useless in their hands. Even the host panel, known for rapid-fire analysis, hesitated. It wasn't just that Crockett had answered the question, it was that she had reframed the entire conversation, leaving no space for the usual spin. One commentator finally broke the silence with a low, almost reverent murmur. "Well, that was something else." The others nodded, but their words stumbled. Nobody wanted to be the first to attempt to dilute what had just happened. The producers scrambled behind the glass, already replaying the clip, knowing instinctively that this wasn't just television, it was history in motion. And then came the flood. Within minutes of the broadcast ending, social media lit up like a lightning storm. Clips of Crockett's calm yet thunderous response spread across platforms at breakneck speed. Twitter trended instantly. Hashtag Crockett.com soared to the top, followed closely by hashtag Frozen Studio. TikTok edits appeared within the hour, soundtracking her words with swelling music, slow-motion close-ups, and captions that turned her response into a rallying cry. The memes were relentless. A still frame of Wallace blinking mid-interruption became the backdrop for countless jokes about underestimation and arrogance. Another showed Crockett's poised expression with the caption, "This is what composure looks like." Young activists stitched her clip into their videos, saying, "This is why we fight." Parents shared it with their children as proof that dignity can silence disrespect. Ordinary viewers joined the chorus too. Comments poured in. "I've never felt so seen on live TV." Or, "She didn't just answer for herself, she answered for all of us." Grace under fire. That's leadership. The response was not just political, it was deeply personal. People felt ownership of the moment, as if Crockett's calm defiance had validated their own struggles, their own quiet battles to be heard. But the ripple effect didn't stop with everyday viewers. Within hours, politicians began weighing in. Progressive allies praised her with enthusiasm, some calling her words a masterclass in grace under pressure. Even rivals who usually dismissed her tread carefully, their statements laced with uneasy respect. A few attempted to spin the narrative, suggesting Wallace had simply been doing his job, but those attempts landed flat. The clip itself was too clear, too powerful, too undeniable. Commentators on rival networks tried their best to downplay it. Some argued it was overblown. Others insisted the exchange had been a draw, but their hesitancy betrayed them. The audience wasn't buying it. Every replay of Crockett's calm, his piercing words only reinforced the truth. She had not just survived the confrontation, she had defined it. Late-night hosts picked it up too. Monologues joked about Wallace meeting his match, while audiences laughed and applauded at the idea of a journalist so famous for cornering others finally being the one cornered himself. But beneath the humor was respect. Everyone knew they had witnessed a rare inversion of power, one where the outsider dictated the terms of the conversation. In community centers, group chats, and dinner tables across the country. The moment was replayed, retold, and reinterpreted. For some, it was proof that calm strength could dismantle arrogance. For others, it was a signal that the next generation of leaders was ready to claim their space. And for many, it was personal vindication, a reminder that they too had endured, being interrupted, dismissed, or talked over, and that dignity could still rise victorious. One answer had become something larger. It was no longer about Chris Wallace or a single interview. It was about the idea that silence, composure, and clarity could carry more weight than the loudest voice in the room. Crockett's words didn't just end a segment, it began a movement. And as the hashtags surged, as the clips spread, as commentators scrambled and citizens celebrated, one truth became undeniable. The studio had been frozen, but the country had been awakened. But the true power of her words wasn't just in silencing a studio, it was in awakening a deeper truth about who we are. When the dust settled, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett's calm answer was never just about winning an exchange with Chris Wallace. It was about something larger, something that reached beyond the walls of the studio and into the heart of American identity. In that moment, she reminded the country that dignity, composure, and truth are not weaknesses to be mocked, but strengths that can disarm even the sharpest attack. Too often, politics is reduced to a shouting match, a spectacle designed to score points and inflame divisions. But Crockett refused to play that game. It's by remaining steady, by refusing to mirror the aggression. Leveled at her, she reframed the meaning of strength. She showed that true leadership isn't measured by how loud one can shout, but by how firmly one can hold true principle under pressure. Her response carried echoes of every figure in American history who has faced dismissal, skepticism, or outright hostility, yet met it with grace instead of venom. She embodied the idea that justice is not about theatrics, but about clarity, that the truth, and spoken plainly and with conviction, has a force no amount of bluster can rival. In Crockett's.com defiance, people saw their own struggles reflected. Immigrants who have had to prove their worth again and again. Women who have been interrupted and underestimated. Communities told they didn't belong. She turned a hostile question into a universal reminder that worth is not dictated by gatekeepers of power, but by the integrity of one's actions and words. And that struck at the core of what America claims to be. At its best, this country is not defined by who yells the loudest, but by who stands firm in the face of doubt. It is not defined by gatekeeping legacies, but by the courage of new voices rising. Crockett's moment was not just hers. It was America's, a brief but powerful vision of what resilience and fairness looked like when brought to life. Her words became more than a response. They became a lesson. They told every viewer, you don't need to raise your voice to raise the truth. You don't need to conform to the script written for you by those in power. You can hold your ground with quiet certainty, and in doing so, you can change the atmosphere around you. That is why the clip spread with such intensity. It wasn't simply entertainment, it was empowerment. People shared it because they wanted their friends, their families, their communities to see that dignity can still prevail. They wanted to remind one another that, even in a cynical era of noise and spectacle, composure can be revolutionary. The moral crystallized into something timeless. That leadership is not a contest of egos, but a service of truth. Crockett revealed that sometimes the greatest strength lies not in domination, but in restraint. Not in overwhelming force, but in unshakable clarity in a world of noise. Sometimes the calmest voice is the most powerful weapon. And in that studio, Jasmine Crockett wielded it with precision, transforming an attempted trap into a moment of national reflection. Her answer, simple and steady, will echo long after the lights of that broadcast fade, reminding us that justice is not always thunder, it can also be the silence that follows when the truth finally lands. Because at the end of the day, America does not move forward by those who interrupt, but by those who endure. And that endurance, embodied in Crockett's poise, is the kind of quiet courage that can change the course of history. Chris Wallace pushed Jasmine Crockett on live television, but in the end, he was the one left frozen silent. What began as an attempt to corner her became the stage for one of the most powerful displays of composure we've seen in recent memory. She stood steady while the pressure mounted, and with a calm answer, she transformed the entire moment into something bigger than a debate, became a reminder of what dignity looks like when it refuses to bend. We watched the arc unfold. The sharp question meant to break her, the rising tension as Wallace pressed, the silence before her reply, and then the revelation. Crockett didn't just respond, she rewrote the rules in real time. That is why the clip has spread far beyond one studio, far beyond politics, and into the hearts of people who saw themselves in her resilience. And now the question turns to us. What do we do with a moment like this? Do we let it pass as another flash of entertainment, or do we carry its message forward? If you believe that calm strength should never be underestimated, dignity is more powerful than arrogance, then you're part of this story too. So join us. Subscribe to this channel, share this video, and be part of a community that believes in lifting up voices that embody truth and resilience. Together, we can amplify moments like this, not as fleeting clips, but as reminders of the future we want to build, because if this night proved anything, it's this. The truth may be quiet, but it shakes the loudest rooms. And Jasmine Crockett just showed us how.